If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. This is just a reminder that this podcast has merch and a Patreon, and if you could contribute to one of those to help keep this podcast going, I would greatly appreciate it. I wanted to give a quick content warning before we get started. In this episode, I mention an execution. I don't go into too graphic detail, but I do go into a little bit of detail. But it's only for a few seconds. And if you skip over the part, it's not going to affect your understanding of what's going on. So I will leave a timestamp in the episode description in case you want to skip over that part. Alright, well, now let's get into the episode. For years, King James VI of Scotland longed to also be King James I of England. He longed to be the one to unite the two countries and make them one. He planned, he plotted. He looked the other way when Queen Elizabeth I ordered the execution of his mother, and then he called himself Elizabeth's son afterwards. So, what was the reaction that James received from the people of England after he got what he wanted? Well, at first, it was joy. Joy that turned into scheming. Scheming to kill a king. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 6th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled, They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So, some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time, there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about King James VI and I. This is King James VI and I, part 2. So obviously there was a part 1. If you haven't already listened to part 1, I recommend that you stop this episode and you go back and you listen to it. But if you want to listen to part 2 first, you do you. I will be getting into a recap here in a few seconds, but I'm not going to cover everything that I covered in part 1. I'm just going to recap the bits that I think it's important for you to remember to help you understand what's going on in part 2 of the story. So, the recap. King James VI and First was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Lord Darnley. Lord Darnley was murdered when James was a baby. Mary may have had something to do with his murder. Mary was forced to abdicate, and James became King of Scotland when he was 1 year old. And he never saw his mother again. So it was a sort of you're on your own kid type situation. Though he did have regents and caregivers and tutors around him, he was never really raised by his parents. James was raised a Protestant, even though both of his parents were Catholics. Scotland used to be a Catholic country, and then Protestantism pretty much took over. One of his lovers may have been a man by the name of Esme Stuart. And James wanted to be the King of England, so he made peace with England. And that's where I left off last week. And last week I told you that I would start this episode with telling you about James's wife. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Now let's talk about James's wife. He was a king, and so he had to produce an heir. And so he needed a wife. The woman that was picked to be his wife was Anne of Denmark. Anne was 14 years old and James was 22. They had a proxy marriage in Copenhagen in August of 1589, and then Anne sailed off for England. But she didn't make it to England due to storms. Because of the storms, she was stuck in Norway. James was in a hurry to meet his bride, and so he sailed to her. Historian Dave Harris Wilson described James sailing to Anne as, quote, the one romantic episode of his life, end quote. James and Anne were married at Bishop's Palace in Oslo on November 23, 1589. They stayed in Norway for a while, and they didn't return to England until May 1st, 1590. Before James married Anne, he was praised for his chastity because he preferred the company of men. After his marriage to Anne, he was affectionate with her. He seemed to be infatuated with her. They had trouble conceiving, and that made people question James's masculinity, and they wondered if he could produce a child. And people were bringing up the fact that he loved hanging around his male favorites. But eventually Anne did become pregnant, and she gave birth on February 19, 1594, to Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales. But the birth of their son changed James and Anne's relationship. Anne wanted to be a hands-on mother. She wanted to raise her son herself. James wanted to put Henry's care in the hands of a guardian, and that is what he did. And it made James and Anne distant. But they still went on to have more children. Elizabeth, Queen of Bohemia, was born on August 19, 1596. Margaret was born on December 24, 1598. King Charles I was born on November 19, 1600. Robert, Duke of Kintyre and Lorne, was born on January 18, 1602. Mary was born on April 8, 1605, and Sophia was born on June 22, 1606. Henry, Elizabeth, and Charles were the only ones that survived childhood. Mary died in March of 1600 of an unknown illness. He was 1 year old. Robert died on May 27, 1602 of an unknown illness. He was 4 months old. Mary died on September 16, 1607 of pneumonia. She was 2 years old. And Sophia died on June 23, 1606. She was born weak, and she died when she was just 1 day old. Margaret, Robert, Mary, and Sophia would not be the only children that James and Anne would bear in their life. Their firstborn, Henry, died on November 6, 1612 of typhoid fever. He was 18 years old. James's wife wasn't the only woman, or Anne, that held the king's affection. Anne Murray, who is also known by her married name Anne Lyon, Countess of Kinghorn, and is sometimes written as Agnes, was the mistress of James. Anne was probably a member of Anne of Denmark's household. James actually wrote 2 poems about her. They are titled A Dream on His Mistress, My Lady Glamis, and A Complaint on His Mistress's Absence from Court. Her husband's aristocratic title was Lord Glamis. In the last poem, this is how he describes her absence from court. Quote, "The court as garland lacks the chiefest fleur. The court as a Chatham tune that lacks her stone. The court is a garland missing her chiefest flower. The court is an empty button that lacks her gemstone." End quote. John Carey, the son of the governor of Berwick-upon-Tweed, wrote to Queen Elizabeth I's chief advisor, William Cecil, about James's affair with Anne. It was rumored that Anne's children, Patrick, Frederick, and Anne, were not fathered by her husband Patrick Lyon, but by James. Now, the poems and the letter are the only proof that we have of the affair. Some believe that this affair was staged because it happened around the time that James and his wife Anne were having trouble getting pregnant, and people were starting to talk about how James liked being around men. I can't answer the question whether or not James was bisexual. I don't think anyone can. I think it is important to remember that he did seem to show his wife real affection until they drifted apart. Some feel more comfortable just using the term queer when it comes to James, and I think that might be the best term to describe him to a modern audience. James had spent some time in Denmark. Remember, that was where his wife was from. In Denmark, witch hunts were a common thing. James learned about them, and they became a hyperfixation for him. He turned learning about witches and hunting witches into a personality trait. He attended the North Berwick witch trials in Scotland in 1590. More than 100 people were accused of witchcraft in those witch trials. James personally supervised the torture of women accused of witchcraft. James became convinced that witches were trying to kill him. He believed that witches were responsible for the storms that kept Anne from sailing to England. One of the, quote, witches that he thought was responsible for the storms was a woman named Agnes Sampson. If you are not new to this podcast, then the name Agnes Sampson may sound familiar to you. I did an episode on Agnes. It was season 2, episode 8. Because I have already done an episode on Agnes, I'm not going to go into too much detail about her ordeal. But what you need to know is that Agnes was tortured, strangled, and then burned at the stake. In 1597, James wrote Demonology. This was a book that he wrote in all seriousness about the methods that demons use to bother troubled men. This book endorsed witch hunting. This book also could have been one of the things that inspired the play Macbeth, written by someone that I've already covered this season, William Shakespeare. Which, when I picked the title of season 2 of History Shelf, which, if you don't remember, it was titled Something Wicked This Way Comes, which I got from the play Macbeth, I chose that title because season 2 was all about people from history that had been accused of witchcraft. When I chose the title of the season that Agnes Sampson was going to be covered on, I had no idea that James's demonology was probably one of the inspirations for Macbeth. So this is sort of a full circle moment for History Shelf. Thanks to James, around 2,500 people were executed for being a witch. That was 5 times the average European execution rate per capita. I don't know about you, but my hyperfixations have never led to the execution of around 2,500 people. The most extreme thing that one of my hyperfixations have led to is a book/movie led me to the current theme of the season of this podcast. But more on that when I cover the sixth person that I'm going to cover this season. By 1599, James was kind of over his hyperfixation, and he had become more skeptical of people being witches. James authorized the Gentleman Adventures of Fife, also known as Fife Adventures. Before I get into that, I need to explain to you Scotland a little bit. So there are the lowlands of Scotland and the highlands of Scotland. There were major differences between the people of the highlands and the people of the lowlands. The lowlands were where most of the nobles lived, and the people that lived in the highlands, they were seen as lawless barbarians. They spoke Gaelic in the highlands, and during James's time, Gaelic became known as Ars or Irish. So they were trying to say that it was a foreign language, so further separating the highlands from the lowlands. During James's time, Parliament sought to abolish the language. The Gentleman Adventures of Fife was a way to civilize the highlands. An act of Parliament required that all Highland clan chiefs prove that they owned their land. The clans of the Highlands didn't really have documentation that their ancestral lands were indeed theirs. So nobles were able to take that opportunity and create papers for lands that they wanted. And what ended up happening was a recolonization of the Highlands. Parliament passed the Statutes of Iona, and that was Parliament trying to erase the culture of the Highlands. The provisions of the Statutes of Iona were 1. The provision and support of Protestant ministers to Highland parishes. 2. The establishment of inns to be set up in convenient places in all the islands for accommodation of travelers, and to end the custom of extorting free quarters and provision. 3. Beggars were outlawed. 4. The prohibition of general import and sale of wine and whiskey, except to chiefs and other gentlemen who were permitted to purchase wine and aquavitae from the lowlands for household consumption. 5. The education of the children of any gentleman or yeoman in possession of more than 60 cattle in lowland schools, where they may be found able sufficiently to speak, read, and write English. 6. The prohibition from carrying yagba and pistols out of their own houses, or shooting at deer, hares, or fowls. 7. The outlawing of bards and other bearers of traditional culture, and if you were caught doing that, you were expelled from the islands. And 8. The prohibition on the protection of fugitives. As you can imagine, this pissed some of the people in the Highlands off. People don't typically like it when you try to erase their culture. James's cousin Patrick Stewart, 2nd Earl of Orkney, was one of those people. Patrick came from the Northern Isles. Patrick was imprisoned for resisting the Statutes of Iona. Patrick's son Robert led a rebellion against James, but it was unsuccessful, and it ended with Robert and Patrick being hanged. Their estates were forfeited, and their islands were annexed to the crown. Now, James hadn't always been anti-Scottish. He published Poetic Manual and a description of the poetic tradition in his native tongue of Scots, which was the language spoken by Lowland Scotland. The book was called Some Rules and Cautions to be Observed and Eschewed in Scottish Prosody. That was published in 1584, but the reason why he was pushing for English to be taught is because he had his eye on the English throne. He really wanted to be the king of England after Queen Elizabeth I died, and his wish would soon be granted. In 1601, James began corresponding with Elizabeth's chief minister, Robert Cecil. These correspondence were to prepare James to take the throne after Elizabeth's death. On March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth died. Now, it was said that on her deathbed, Elizabeth named James as her heir, and that was what was believed for over 400 years. When I did the episode on Elizabeth back in 2022, that was what everyone thought had happened. But here recently, and by recently I mean last year, so 2023, we now know that that isn't true. We thought this because a historian in Elizabeth's time named William Camden wrote this. But thanks to art imaging technology, we are able to see some of the things that William wrote that have been blacked out or written over. And we now know from these pages that Elizabeth didn't name anyone as her heir. But nonetheless, James did become the King of England, and that is why he is known as King James VI and the First. He was the sixth James in Scotland to be king, but he was the first James in England to be king. James left Edinburgh on April 5th, 1603, and he headed for London. He promised that he would return to Scotland every 3 years, but he broke that promise. Because to James, Scotland was the shit on his shoe, and England was the crown jewel. This is how he compared Scotland to England. He said that he was, quote, swapping a stony couch for a deep feather bed, end quote. James arrived in London on May 7th, 1603. This was 9 days after Elizabeth's funeral, and he was met with crowds. James was coronated at Westminster Abbey on July 25th, 1603. It was a good time, even though there were some restrictions due to an outbreak of plague. He couldn't have a ceremony in London until March of 1604. At the time, Westminster Abbey was not a part of London. This warm welcome did not last forever, though. James was soon faced with people that wanted to take him off the throne. People wanted change when James took the crown. There were issues people had with the government. People were upset with monopolies or taxes, and the government was £400,000 in debt. There were people that were disappointed when James kept Elizabeth's privy councillors in office, but he did fairly early on add a supporter of his by the name of Henry Howard and Henry's nephew Thomas Howard. There were 2 plots against James. The first one was known as the Byplot. So, for decades, England had been going back and forth from being a Catholic country and being a Protestant country. Listen to the first season of History Shelf if you want to learn more about this. Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant, and during her reign, there were some anti-Catholic laws passed. Obviously, Catholics were not happy about this, but there were also some Puritans that were not happy about these laws. There were some that wanted to live in a country where everyone was free to worship as they wanted without fear of any legal action against them. So, together, they came up with a plot. So, the plan of the Byplot, also known as the Catholic plot, the surprising treason, the treason of the priests, or Watson's plot. William Watson was a Catholic priest involved in the plot. The plan was to kidnap James, and then they were going to force James to revoke the anti-Catholic laws. William Watson set the day for the plot. It was June 24th, 1603. The plot was discovered by Archpriest George Blackwell and 2 Jesuits, John Gerald and Henry Garnet. They got word to Robert Cecil about the plot, but he already knew about it. I don't know if I've said this already. William Cecil was the father of Robert Cecil, and William was the chief advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and after William died, Robert took over. So Robert already knew about the plot. It's possible that a man by the name of Anthony Copley was a double agent. So after that, the plan fell apart. Sir George Brooke, who was involved in the Byplot, was arrested in January of 1603. His brother, Henry Brooke, 11th Baron Cobham, was also arrested. Henry was involved in a more serious plot known as the main plot. More on that in a little bit. On July 15th, George was arraigned, and he made it known that the byplot and the main plot, while happening at the same time, they were by two separate groups of plotters. On July 16th, William Watson's arrest was issued, and he was arrested on August 5th. He confessed to the plot. On August 13th, William Clark, another priest involved in the plot, was arrested. On August 15th, two Catholic priests, Sir George Brooke and Sir Griffin Markham, were tried. On December 15th, 1603, George was executed for high treason. On August 17th, 1603, Sir Walter Walling was tried. He ended up being beheaded on October 29th, 1618, and many thought that his execution was unjust because he was executed for his connection with the main plot, but the only thing that he did was he had one meeting with one of the plotters of the main plot, and that was Henry Brooke. Walter's head was embalmed and then presented to his wife. His body was buried at his home, but then it was later moved to St. Margaret's. Thomas Grey, 15th Baron Grey de Wilton, was tried, and he was found guilty on November 18th, 1603. Thomas, along with Sir Griffin Markham, was taken to the scaffold and pardoned on December 10th, 1603. He spent the rest of his life in the Tower of London. Griffin went into exile, and he became a spy for Robert Cecil. The only one that was acquitted in the byplot was Sir Edward Parkham. William Watson and William Clark were executed on November 29, 1603. On February 22nd, 1604, James ordered all Roman Catholic clergy to leave his kingdom by March 19, 1604. And Anthony Copley was sentenced to death, but he was pardoned on August 18, 1604. Now to the main plot. So, I said earlier that the main plot was more serious than the byplot. The main plot was a conspiracy that was going to remove James from the throne and replace him with his first cousin, Lady Arabella Stuart. Arabella was Catholic. This plan was concocted by Catholic nobles. It was allegedly led by Henry Brooke, and the Spanish government was the one supposedly funding it. Henry was talking to a Habsburg, Charles de Ligne, 2nd Prince of Arenberg, to get Spain to send him money. A great deal of money, approximately £160,000. Henry was going to travel to Brussels, and from there he was going to go to Spain to get the money. He was going to take the money back to England via Jersey. Sir Walter Walling was the governor there. The main plot was not successful. Henry tried to get Arabella involved in the plot, so he sent her a letter telling her how they were going to kill James and put her on the throne. Arabella then gave that letter to James. Things would eventually go south between James and Arabella when she married William Seymour, 2nd Duke of Somerset. William had a claim to the throne, and Arabella married him in secret without the king's permission on June 22nd, 1610. And that was seen as a threat. So James first put Arabella and William under house arrest. When they tried to escape England, they were captured and taken to the Tower of London. They both escaped the Tower in June of 1610. William was able to make it to freedom, but Arabella was recaptured and then taken back to the Tower of London. She spent the rest of her days in the Tower, and she died on September 15, 1615, at the age of 39. But back to the main plot. So the main plot was found out about. Both Henry Brooke and Walter Walling were imprisoned in the Tower of London. Walter spent 13 years in the Tower, and then he was executed, which I already told you about. Henry became sick in the Tower, and he was released the same year that Walter was executed, in 1618. Henry died only months after being released. The main plot would not be the last plot against James. In the early days of James's reign, he let the mundane day tasks be handled by his advisors. Robert Cecil was still around, and he was helping run the government, as was Baron Ellesmere and Lord Chancellor Thomas Egerton and the Earl of Dorset and Lord Treasurer Thomas Sackville. This let James do other things that he was interested in, like writing and hunting, and also working on uniting Scotland and England. He wanted Scotland and England to be one country. In 1604, he tried to make this happen. In a speech that he gave to the English Parliament, he said that God had, quote, made us all in one island, compassed with one sea, and of itself by nature so indivisible, end quote. He told them that being a king of two countries made him feel like, quote, a polygamist and husband to two wives, end quote. He didn't want to be called the King of Scotland or the King of England. He wanted to be called the King of Great Britain. Neither England or Scotland wanted to be one country. In April of 1604, the Commons refused to call him the King of Great Britain. On July 7th, 1604, he prorogued Parliament. He said, quote, I will not think where I feel no thanks due. He continued on, I am not of such a stock as to praise fools. You see how many things you did not well. I wish you would make use of your liberty with more modesty in time to come. End quote. In October of 1604, James was like, I don't care what you say. I'm going to do what I want to do. And he started calling himself the King of Great Britain. Francis Bacon, 1st Viscount of St. Alban, was the Lord Chancellor of England after Sir Thomas Egerton. I don't know if you remember or not, but this is the second time Francis has made a guest appearance on this podcast. He showed up just 2 weeks ago on the William Shakespeare episode. Anyway, Francis was like, I hate to burst your bubble, bro, but you cannot put the King of Great Britain on any legal proceeding, instrument, or assurance, because the King of Great Britain is not an actual thing. The title was also not used on any English statues because, again, the King of Great Britain was not a real thing. But despite it not being a real thing, James still forced Scottish Parliament to use it, and it was used on proclamations, coinage, letters, and treaties in both Scotland and England. In August of 1604, James put an end to the Anglo-Spanish War that was started by Queen Elizabeth I and King Philip II of Spain. Even though England and Spain signed a peace treaty, there was still some tension between England and Spain since James continued to oppress Catholics in his country, and Spain was a Catholic country. Now, I said earlier that the main plot was not the last plot to try and take James off the throne. There was also the gunpowder plot. Now, if the gunpowder plot sounds familiar to you, but you don't know anything about King James VI and First except from what I have told you in this episode and what I told you last week, then perhaps you have heard about it from this nursery rhyme that goes, Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot, I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up the king and parliament. 70 barrels of powder below, poor old England to overthrow. By God's providence he was catched, with a dark lantern and burning match. Holler boys, let the bells ring. Holler boys, God save the king. The gunpowder plot of 1605 has also been called the gunpowder treason plot and the Jesuit treason. So, like I have been explaining, England had went back and forth from being a Catholic country to being a Protestant country. James was more tolerant towards Catholics than Queen Elizabeth I was. James thought the best solution for dealing with Catholics would be to exile them from England. So there was still Catholics that were unhappy. When James's mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was executed, she was seen as a Catholic martyr. Some Catholics in England were hoping that that would persuade James to convert to Catholicism, but it didn't. Sometime around 1592 or 1600, James's wife, Anne of Denmark, secretly converted to Catholicism, but James remained a Protestant until the day he died. Anne was even sent a rosary from Pope Clement VIII on February 19th, 1604, which led James to denounce the Catholic Church, and like I said earlier, he ordered all Jesuits and other Catholic priests to leave England. He also reimposed the collection of fines for recusancy. Recusancy was the state of those who remained loyal to the Catholic Church and refused to attend Church of England services. In 1558, the Act of Uniformity 1588 made it law that everyone had to attend Church of England services once a week or be fined 12 pence, which back then that was equal to about 3 days of wages. Not a lot of Catholics could afford to pay that. There were some Catholics that could pay, and when James took the throne, almost £5,000 a year was being collected in fines. That would be around £12 million in 2020's money. On March 19, 1604, James made his first speech to English Parliament. He wanted to secure peace by, quote, profession of the true religion, end quote. James used this speech to tell Catholics not to increase their numbers in England. With the main plot, the goal was simple. Well, as simple as regicide can be. There was one target, James. With the gunpowder plot, there were multiple targets. The plotters wanted James dead, and they also wanted James's close relatives and members of the Privy Council dead. This was going to go down at the state opening of Parliament. The senior judges, Protestant aristocracy, and the bishops of the Church of England were going to be there. The plotters also wanted to kidnap James's daughter Elizabeth. Elizabeth was only 9 years old at the time, so their plan was to kidnap her, and they would really just use her as a figurehead, and they would rule the country. So, who were these plotters? There were 13 of them. They were Robert Catesby, John Wright, Christopher Wright, Robert Winter, Thomas Percy, Guy Fawkes, Robert Keyes, Thomas Bates, John Grant, Ambrose Rockwood, Sir Everard Digby, and Francis Tresham. The plotters had a plan to make Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, as Elizabeth's regent, but they probably never told him that or any of what they were planning. And the plotters had not really figured out what they were going to do with James's sons Henry and Charles. The plan with them was just to wing it. So there were a lot of moving parts in this plan. The plan started with Robert Catesby. Robert was no stranger to rebellion. He took part in the Essex Rebellion in 1601. Queen Elizabeth I let him walk away with just a fine. In February of 1604, Robert started talking to Thomas Winter. That is when the plan to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament was born. Also present at these talks was John Wright. He also wasn't afraid of rebellion. He too took part in the Essex Rebellion. Thomas Winter was apprehensive to go forward with the plan because he feared what would happen if they failed, but Robert was able to talk him into it. So Thomas went to Spain to see if he could get support there. When he was there, he met with Guy Fawkes. Guy and John Wright's brother, Christopher Wright, had pleaded to the Spanish court in 1603 to invade England. So obviously they were also pretty keen on rebellion as well. Guy and Christopher returned to England and told Robert not to hold out hope for Spanish support. A few weeks after this, Robert Catesby's friend and John Wright's brother-in-law, Thomas Percy, joined the plot. Thomas was related to Henry Percy, and he was employed by him. On May 20th, 1604, Robert Catesby, Thomas Winter, John Wright, Guy Fawkes, and Thomas Percy met, and they swore an oath of secrecy on a prayer book. On June 9th, 1604, Henry Percy appointed Thomas Percy to the band of gentlemen pensioners, which is the British monarch's bodyguard. So he got a base in London because of this. Guy Fawkes then posed as Thomas's servant using the pseudonym John Johnson. and took charge of the building. The plotters had a lodging on the other side of the Thames in Lambeth, and that is where they stored the gunpowder and their other supplies, and they would row them across each night. In October of 1604, the plotters returned to London, this time with a new member to their party. It was a guy down on his luck with nothing left to lose, a man by the name of Robert Keyes. Robert's job in the plot was to take charge of the house in Lambeth. In December of 1604, Thomas Bates joined the plot. He was a servant of Robert Catesby. He was added when he accidentally found out about the plot. Parliament was set to open in February of 1605, but it was announced on December 24th, 1604, that it would be delayed due to plague. It was pushed back to October 3rd, 1605. During their wait, it was claimed that the plotters were digging a tunnel beneath Parliament. Though there has been no proof of this tunnel, it is believed to be a lie created by the government. Spoiler alert, this plan does not go as planned, and the plotters do get caught. Which I'm sure you probably have already guessed that, because this plan sounds like it was sloppily put together, and also I kind of already spoiled it with the nursery rhyme. The tunnel comes from Thomas Winter and Guy Fawkes's Confessions, though Guy did not mention the tunnel until his 5th interrogation. On March 25th, 1605, 3 more plotters had joined the band: Robert Winter, John Grant, and Christopher Wright. Christopher and John were also involved in the Essex Rebellion. On that day, they also bought the lease to the Undercroft that they had allegedly tunneled near to. In the second week of June, Robert Catesby asked Father Henry Garnet about the morality of the destruction of innocent lives with the guilty. So, was it okay to kill innocent people if it meant that you took the guilty out with them? Henry told him that it could be excused. But according to Henry, during their second meeting in July, he scolded Robert and showed Robert a letter from the Pope himself that forbid it. Henry didn't turn in the plotters because the Jesuit priest Oswald Tesimond told Henry that he had taken Robert's confession, so canon law forbid him from telling anyone. Henry tried to talk Robert out of doing it, but Robert had already made his mind up. Guy Fawkes said that 20 barrels of gunpowder was first bought, then 16 more on July 20th, 1605. Plague got in the way of their plans again on July 28th, 1605. It pushed Parliament back from opening up until November 5th, 1605. It was discovered in late August that the gunpowder had decayed. It was like the universe was trying to tell them to abandon the plan, but they weren't listening. Instead of listening, they bought more gunpowder. The last 3 plotters to joined in late 1605, and they were Ambrose Rockwood, Ever Digby, and Robert Catesby's cousin, Francis Tresham. Francis was the last one to join on October 14th, 1605. Francis asked Robert if this plot would damn their souls, and Robert told him that it would not, and that the plight of England's Catholics required that it be done. Robert wanted Francis to let them use Ruston Hall and to give him £2,000, and Francis refused to do both. But he did give £100 to Thomas Winter, so he did help fund the plot. So here was the plan. Guy Fawkes was going to light the fuse, and then he would escape across the Thames. While that was going on, a revolt in the Midlands would ensure the capture of Princess Elizabeth. The plotters started to worry about the innocent lives in Parliament. And by innocent, I do mean the ones that the plotters deemed innocent. So, all the Catholics, and Henry Percy because he was a Catholic sympathizer. One of the Catholics that they were worried about was William Parker, 4th Baron Monteagle. He was the brother-in-law of Francis Tresham. On October 26, 1605, William was sent a letter. The letter was delivered to William by a servant that said that the letter was from a stranger in the road. William ordered the servant to read the letter to him out loud in front of company, and this is what the letter said, quote, "My lord, out of love I bear to some of your friends. I have a care of your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift attendance at this Parliament. For God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall not see who hunts them. This counsel is not to be condemned, because it may do you good, and can do you no harm, for the danger is past as soon as you have burnt the letter. And I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I condemn you." End quote. William wasn't really sure what this letter meant, but he felt like that it was bad. So he took it to Robert Cecil. Robert was somehow in the know that something was about to go down, but he didn't know what or who was planning it. So he just decided to chill and see what happened. Thomas Ward was a servant of William's, and he had a family connection with the Wright brothers. So he sent word to Robert Catesby that they had been betrayed. Robert suspected that it was Francis that had sent the letter. Robert, who was about to go hunting with the king, the guy that Robert wanted to kill. So before he went hunting with the king, Robert and Thomas Winter confronted Francis. Francis convinced them that they had got the wrong guy, and he urged them not to go forward with the plot. And that is where I'm going to stop this episode. So there will be a part 3 of King James the 6th and 1st. I don't know if there'll be a part 4, but there definitely will be a part 3. So next week, I will pick up where we left off with the gunpowder plot. I promise, next week you will have the conclusion of the gunpowder plot. So thank you so much for listening to the 6th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I am going to be covering 15 people this season, but who knows how many episodes it's going to be. Next week's episode is going to be King James the 6th and 1st, part 3. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf, the Twitter is at History Shelf Pod, the Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod, and the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose a theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mail to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the zip-up hoodie. If you want to take out ad space on this podcast, I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links, there's one for Riverside, there's one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support this podcast financially, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just talked about will be in the episode description for this episode. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. Well, until next week, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.